that we wanted an Africa which has ethics and has traditions and values that are African. We said that we wanted an Africa where women and youth were at the center of our development. We said that we wanted an Africa that could play at the center of the world, an Africa that was strong. Those were the 7 promises and 7 aspirations that we underlined under Africa Agenda 2063. And I remember then the then chairperson of the AU Council, Nkosan Dlamini Zuma, writing an imaginary letter to Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and saying, we know what you people are thinking about, but we hope that by the year 2063, Africa will be a middle-level economy. That Africa will have railway lines running from Addis Ababa to Dakar, from Cape Town to Tunis in Tunisia, and that possibly Malawi in the heart of Africa will be the hub of tourism and our continental fish will be Jambo. We said many things. It was informed by the realization that Africa must now rise up and begin to look at our resources in a manner that will benefit the continent. One may think that those were mere theories and that is not important, but I want to remind us that if we don't take care of those fundamentals, Africa will pay the price. Many Africans have now agonized over the state of Africa and posed fundamental questions. What is it that we can and must do if Africa is to rise and to play a role in the world? Some of the most recent writings, perhaps not so recent, but as recent as the year 2010, the South African writer Greg Mills, in a book which I commend to you, poses the question or states why Africa is poor and what Africa can do about it. And in that book, Greg Mills argues that poverty is a choice and that Africans, through their leaders, have made the decision to be poor. And he also said, citing a statement made by a lady who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, that part of the problem in Africa is that in many African countries we want things that require effort, but we don't want to make the effort. You may disagree with that kind of assessment, but the truth is Africa is becoming poorer and poorer in real terms by the day. When you see what are described as xenophobic attacks in South Africa, it is informed by poverty of the mind and poverty of material things. It is the belief by downgraded people who are under the table, that the crumbs under the table is what constitutes the whole meal, while the big dinner is actually happening on the top of the table. And I'm submitting to us that we must liberate ourselves, including you professionals, from the belief that there is these things that will happen without efforts on our part. And I'm saying we must ask ourselves, what are the resources available to us going forward so that we are able to fight and liberate ourselves in critical ways in a manner that I will demonstrate. Writing in the year 2010, the late Callistus Juma of Kenya, in a book which all of us ought to have read, The New Harvest, Callistus Juma says that if we cannot feed ourselves as Africans, then we cannot play a critical part in the affairs of the world. Feeding yourselves, I do not know, we are normally told that we have 5 senses, and we have all those 5 senses. But there is another 6th sense, which is satisfying yourself if you have not eaten. Even when you are here, you are given breaks. The reason why you are given breaks, notwithstanding that you are accountants, you are only accountants when you have fed yourselves. If you have not been fed, your accountancy knowledge disappears, and you become animals who are only seeking one thing to eat. And that is why feeding, the ability to feed ourselves, is critical. And Calestas Juma in the New Harvest is telling us that time has come that we must harness technology. Even if you want to be spiritual about it, in those early days, God said, "Go ye and subdue the world." In Africa, we have allowed the world to subdue us. And we are saying that we cannot continue to practice agriculture the way it was practiced by our forefathers. We cannot continue to use the plow. We cannot continue to do that while people are already employing nanotechnology in agriculture, giving crops only the water that it needs. We cannot continue to wait for God or to wait for Godot to come and give us all the things that we need. We must, in the nature of things, employ modern technology. The Israelis have done it, and other people are doing it. Why do we look at the world and say, "Oh, it has not rained this season, therefore our crops have failed"? God gave us the intelligence to do it, and Calestas Juma in the New Harvest is telling us we must do it in order to be able to feed us. It's sad that today, in a number of African countries, we are importing fish from China. From China. Who knows how they feed the fish? We are importing rice from China. Who knows how they grow the rice? We are importing eggs from Romania. Who knows how their chicken are fed? Tell me, perhaps here in Malawi, your chicken went on strike and they no longer lay eggs. Tell me. I'm submitting to all of us that agriculture must be one of the areas in which we focus so that Africa can realize our potential. The assumption that we can continue to receive aid from different parts of the world and that we will become prosperous is completely misguided. The young Zambian writer Dambisa Moyo, who writes on these things, has written a book, Dead Aid. And she says, she was writing in the year 2010, saying that by that time, Africa had received an inflow of $1 trillion or thereabouts, but there was nothing to show for it. You cannot, and I've said this before and I'm repeating it, he or she who is milking a borrowed cow can never be comfortable, because the owner will come when you are addicted to milk. And what do? So my own submission is we must have our own cows. We must harness our own resources, and we can, and we must do it. Writing in the year 2017 in a book which I'm reading, which I find very fascinating, Greg Mills, Jeffrey Hubbs, and Olusegun Obasanjo have a book they have written called Making Africa Work. They are recognizing that Africa can actually work. And Africa has worked before. And it is you who are gathered here, who are professionals and others in different parts of the world, that can make Africa work. I remember not so long ago when your former president who worked with the World Bank, Mbingu wa Mutharika, became the president, and he came in with very good ideas about dealing with the question of the shortage of maize. And within a short time, there was surplus maize here in Malawi. There was. And countries imported maize from Malawi. The soil did not change. President Mbingu wa Mutharika did not come with an army of angels to introduce angelic agriculture. It is the same people, it is the same land. What you did is that he simply presided over the implementation of policies that already existed. It can be done, and it must be done, because if it is not done, we are done. And one of the things that is very important to recognize is that if we don't attend to these things, there are consequences that we make. In a book written in 2018 by Dambisa Moyo called The Edge of Chaos, she says that it is now quite obvious that liberal democracies are in danger because we have young people without opportunities, and if we have young people without opportunities, then they can very easily degenerate into violence. In the book that I talked about, written by Obasanjo, Greg Mills, and Jeffrey Hubbs, they actually recognize that by the year 2045, the population of Africa will be 2 billion and 50% will be living in urban areas. When people will be living in urban areas, there will be pressure on sanitation. There will be pressure on water. There will be pressure on food. The diminished opportunities will have moved into the fourth industrial revolution, which is already being embraced by others. A job that required 20 employees will now be undertaken by one robot. And the truth, therefore, is that if we don't focus on these things, we will be quarreling about water. As I speak to you now, there is already a conflict which is beginning to fester between Egypt and Ethiopia about only yesterday, the 20th of September 2019, Egyptians are telling the Ethiopians to control them so that we are able to determine what amount of water is released into the Nile. And the Ethiopians are saying, this is our water, we are going to generate 6,000 megawatts of electricity, and we don't accept it. The next wars that will be fought will be about water and about food. And I'm saying this because in the last 30 years, if you go to the Sahelian region, Lake Chad has shrunk by 80%. 80%, which means that those who are fishing in those areas can no longer fish. You therefore can understand why that Sahelian area has now become a fertile ground for recruiting people who join Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda. And you can understand, therefore, why there is no peace in Burkina Faso. You can understand why there is unrest in Chad. You can understand why there is no peace in Niger, why there is no peace and quiet in Nigeria, why there is no peace in Mali and Mauritania. You can understand. You can understand why there is discomfort in Tunisia. You can understand why there is discomfort in Sudan and in South Sudan. These are the critical issues that we must worry. You may say, but no, we are accountants in Malawi. We are landlocked. By the time that this arrives on us, Jesus will have come if you are Christian. And you will be in heaven. Who tells you Jesus is coming tomorrow? Because in God years, 1,000 years could be one day. Or we don't know. But even if he came, there is a sense in which we'll still need water. There is a sense in which we'll still need to live. These are the resources that we are talking about. And I'm submitting, therefore, that going forward, Africa must begin to reorient. You know, when I read Lee Kuan Yew, from third world to first world, the divorce between Malaysia and Singapore was not a velvet divorce. It was painful. One partner wanted to remain in the marriage. Singapore did not want to leave. But the other partner said, you leave. Malaysia may have thought that they were writing the obituary of Singapore. Little did they know that they were writing the foreword for Singapore. Several years down the line, without resources except the most important resource on earth, human resource, because that is the most important resource on earth. The country reoriented herself. Today, one of the biggest and busiest ports in the world is Singapore. Today, one of the countries that is moving towards shortage of labor, that they have no people to work, shortage of labor. If you say that in Africa, they'll say you are telling us cock and bull stories. In Singapore, they have shortage of labor and they import labor, human resource. How did they do it? They identified what was in their best interest and leveraged on their strengths. Today, Singapore per capita is at the highest. If you look at many African countries, our per capita income, if it is over $1,000, then we celebrate with song and dance. But even when we celebrate, one African politician what ought to be owned by 100 Africans, so that the per capita income is deceptive. The question is, if Singapore did it, how can we do it? And why must we not do it? And what are our resources? Africa is the richest continent on earth and has always been. In the last 2 weeks, I've read 2 books. One is written by Ambassador Kahende of Kenya. It's about David Livingstone, the vagabond explorer. And he talks about the young David Livingstone, a Scottish explorer, coming into these parts of the world and even naming your own former capital after a Scottish city, Blantyre. He goes into Zimbabwe and finds the Mosi-otunya Falls and says that Mosi-otunya is too difficult for the tongue, and he says Victoria Falls. And you and me now say very fondly, I'm going to Vic Falls. Not Mosi-otunya. And another young explorer called Speak goes to East Africa and finds another big lake, which you who speak the Chichewa would call Nyanja, and he calls it Victoria, Lake Victoria. And here we are saying Victoria, Lake Victoria, not Lake Nyanja. Why did they come to Africa? Why did they come to the Monomotapa Empire? Because Africa had resources. Gold, diamond. The animals were here. Some even say, if they want to romanticize, that if the Garden of Eden must have been here, and I suspect it was. They saw the rivers, the Zambezi, the Limpopo, the Congo, the Nile, the Niger. Livingstone came. Then I read another book, Oporto, written by the Sierra Leone Creole Deckerson Thomas. He says how 500 years ago the Portuguese went to Sierra Leone and Liberia and the Gambia, and how they created conflicts among the tribes in that area, the En, the Mende, the Temne. But even before that, how the Arabs came in the eastern coast of Africa, in Zanzibar and in Pemba, and how they came to Sofala down in Mozambique. What is it that brings people to Africa? Have you ever asked that question? There must be something about Africa. Even before the birth of Christ, for those of you who are spiritually inclined, Pythagoras was here learning mathematics. And not only Pythagoras, Alexander the Great was here, and the whole city is named after him, Alexandria. Socrates was here. What brings people to Africa? Even when they wanted to kill Jesus, they say, hide him in Africa. And even when the Qurayshis were attacking the Prophet Muhammad, it is to Kush that he came in Africa. What brings people to Africa? How is it that Europeans in 1884 and 1885 for a whole year sat down in Berlin and said, we must divide this continent called Africa? They were not dividing America. No, they were not. They were not dividing